Sango, it is, what is it here? We're talking, it's July 27th, Friday, July 27th. I want to welcome you to Let's Talk Native on the LTN Radio Network. This program breaks all the rules for Native radio. No buffalo speeches, no mystic healing, and no special Indian prayers. We tackle the real issues facing Native people. We'll look back at our glorious and our grave history, a tough look at where we're at now, and look forward to our ongoing battles for autonomy and our free and independent existence. Let's Talk Native is produced in association with Iroquois Promotions on the LTN Radio Network, streaming live from the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation and simulcast on the Gwe, CKWE in Tandanega. You can find us now on our website. We've got a brand new website. It's www.letstalknative, spelled out in one word, .com. No apostrophe after the before the S, by the way. So Let's Talk Native, one word, letstalknative.com. And there you can find links to the group page, to the audio player of our live stream, and a lot more. Links to our Let's Talk Native TV videos on YouTube, and like I said, and much more. Podcast links, all of it. Look, I'm John Kane. I'm the show's host and producer. I'm joined in studio by Ed Schindler. And I've got Jake Proud on the board, taking care of our cameras and our sound. Studio engineer is Kelly McMillan, and again, I want to welcome you to the show. We do the show twice a week, Mondays and Fridays from 10 to 11, and we do try to tackle issues that either, to me, are not adequately addressed, or they're sometimes mischaracterized. And you know, we did a show on Monday. We talked about women's issues, and one of the things that struck me, not only from a couple of the comments that were mentioned, but it struck me because when you say you're going to talk about women's issues, and then you list women's issues like missing and murdered Indigenous women, and some of the gender inequality issues, and so much more. But among the things that I mentioned was violence against women. And I felt like I got to be clear. Violence against women, although women are the victims, it's a men's issue. I mean, there is no way that you can suggest that somehow women are the ones who have to take the corrective action. Look, they've got to defend themselves in any way that they can. And so I'll say that. But societally, we've got to deal with violence against women by dealing with men. Men are the culprits here. Men are the ones who are perpetrating this violence against women, and oftentimes against children as well. So there's not just a violence issue, but there's a sexual violence issue associated with this stuff. Men are the guilty party here, and there's no way. And I know oftentimes people will try to justify the violence that men perpetrate against women, and sometimes against children as well, and there is no justification. And again, I'm not suggesting that women don't have a role in it, and I'm not saying that I'm not calling them out as being responsible. I'm not victim blaming here, but I think there are things that frankly, as parents, as grandparents, there's things that we have to teach our women, our girls. And it's unfortunate that we do, because the reason we have to teach our girls certain things about what things they need to disclose, and when they do it, and how they do it, and how they have to carry themselves, I guess. And again, I'm not talking about how they dress. I'm not going there. I'm just saying how they have to respond to sexual harassment, sexual violence, and again, and that stuff. We have to do that because of the failings of men, not because of the failings of women. And that's the harsh reality. It's kind of like when I have a lot of conversation, and I am going to talk later in the program a little bit about racism. What people can't white people, what they can't understand is that people of color have to make a calculation on how they deal with everything from being followed by a cop, from how they confront racism, because there's a significant likelihood, because of the systemic nature of racism, that we can't provide a symmetric response to a threat to an injustice, to an attack, we have to be the bigger people, or we have to figure out a way to conduct ourselves. One of the things that strikes me in that conversation, and I'll get back on not just violence against women, but I remember hearing the story of Terry Crews. Now, Terry Crews is, I think he was actually a professional football player. He's an actor. Does a lot of comedy. He's a big, well-built, muscular black man, right? Who has, he's had a lot of a very, very famous roles in television and in film. He tells the story, and he tells this as he stepped forward on the Me Too movement about sexual violence in the workplace. And his story is that he goes to a dinner party, being hosted by the company that is his agency, right? And he goes there with his wife, and somebody who's very prominent in this talent agency comes across the room and grabs him by his genitalia. And in that moment, that for all the elements of rage, and certainly what he knows is his physical superiority to this guy, he has to control himself to not lay this guy out, because he immediately knows that if he lets his emotional response give what is, in all likelihood, most of us would have considered a correct response, he knows that he would be fulfilling that black thug stereotype. And frankly, it could have been career ending for him. So we have to make this calculation based on racism. And it's the same thing I say about women. Women have to make a calculation about how they respond, how they carry themselves in relationships, out in the world, not just in the home, but every place, in the workplace, about surviving. Literally about surviving, life survival, but also, mental health and physical health, surviving the potential for the realization that male dominance is not just about power, it's about violence. So I wanted to make a clarification that even as I talk about things like violence against women, I don't consider violence against women an issue that is a specific women's issue. It is a men's issue. It is a issue that we all, men, women, all of us, have to confront men over, because it is a male behavior. Violence against women is a male behavior, not a female behavior. So, I don't know if this is actually, if I'm responding to somebody posting something to correct me on that, but regardless, I do need to make that correction, because if that's what Ed and I implied, I needed to make sure, or myself, probably because it was more my conversation, I want to make sure that people understand much of this stuff. So even when I talk about racism, I understand that where most of the stuff manifests itself, this bad behavior, and this behavior that is associated with dominating a people, dominating another people, it rests almost entirely, but squarely, on the behavior of men. So tonight, as I talk about men's issues, and not all of it is just to call down men's behavior, but to put a proper emphasis. One of the other things that got brought up in some of the commentary that I didn't get to, because frankly, as much as I'm glad people comment on Facebook, I can't multitask to the point where I can do the show, look in the camera, and look down at the Facebook feed. That's why we take the break at the bottom of the hour, so I can catch up on a little bit. But one of the things that was talked about how the society and the world that we live in now, we have fallen into this behavior of, again, through part of it is is associated with not just with feminism, but with this whole idea of women feeling like they need to be in the workplace, even as a sacrifice. And there's nothing wrong with women being in the workplace, so I'm not condemning that. But the fact is that the role that women could and in my opinion should play with especially with young children, with babies and toddlers, gets diminished because we're all so busy chasing the paycheck, including men. Now, the problem is, 20, 30 years ago, a man could earn a living wage enough to support a family, to support a mother and 2.5 children. That's not the case anymore, and part of it is our own behavior because of us buying into this whole consumerism chase, I guess. I mean, in the old days they used to say, keeping up with the Joneses, right? That's an old expression, but now it's not even about keeping up with your neighbor; it's keeping up with technology. We're all just we're thrust into this never ending consumer market where the latest and greatest thing is available for us to buy. So we're all chasing it, and we're chasing it by working, and we work for somebody else. We work for a paycheck, and we lull ourselves into this false belief that if we work for that paycheck, we can buy the stuff that's going to make our family happy. And in the meantime, we've got our children being raised by somebody else, not by they're not being raised. I mean, it's bad enough that dad is out of the household, but now we got mom out of the household too. So one of you folks on I think it was Ann mentioned it on Facebook last week that we again, this is even along that same vein of feminism, forgetting to take care of motherhood, but in our quest for affluence or trying to hang on to being in the quote unquote middle class of American consumerism and wage earners, I guess we put mom and dad both to work, and so our children are being raised out of the house. So that one specific role that is genetically or gender specific to women, which is motherhood. Well, I mean childbirth, child nursing and nurturing, and although we could argue that beyond breastfeeding, mom or dad can take over from there. We could make that argument. Although I believe that there is a specific role that only a mother can play in the early upbringing of children, and we. Part of it is again, it is a bit of a men's issue because the world that we live in now, it is almost impossible for the average man to earn enough of a living. I mean, and look, I know a lot of it's consumerism, but it's also the price of things like housing, the cost of living in general. It is very, very difficult for one wage earner to earn enough money to live even without the accoutrements, all the lavishness or I guess the luxuries of life. Just the basic necessities is very, very difficult to attain with one wage earner, because even as people want to boast about, the economy is recovered, the jobless numbers are so far down. Yeah, so are the wage numbers, the salaries. So that's what I want to talk a little bit. And I know, Ed, you got some thoughts on this, because we this is and this isn't even native perspective or restricted. I mean, we're not just talking about limiting this to a conversation about native men, because it isn't. It's about part of this thing rests so squarely on the male dominance culture that frankly is supported a lot by religious dogma. And I don't mean just Christianity, but Islam and Judaism. Many of these things are this whole male dominance, and there's other cultures too. So I don't want to limit it just to the big three, religions. But it frankly wasn't part of our culture. Our culture had a different balance between men and women that was based on not just equality in terms of sameness, but in that harmony, in that whole idea of balance between men and women. So I don't know. So I do want to talk about kind of men's issues, but I don't know. What's your thoughts on what I've brought up so far?
I think it's interesting. We were talking about something last week after the show ended, but I want to bring that up. And what we're talking about is that how men generally live from payday to payday. Okay? And at one point in time, historically, women lived not payday to payday, but generation to generation. Because they took care of the children. They took care of the children's children. They helped children to understand how to be parents.
Yeah, I actually created a meme based on the conversation that you and I had after the show, and many of you have responded to it. But and that meme was that men work for Friday, and women, mothers, not women, but mothers work for our future generations. Now, and it's not to say that the income that a man brings in isn't for supporting his family, but again, he's working for a paycheck every week, and although the life of a mother is sometimes regulated by that income to some extent, the role of that mother is something that goes well beyond something that can be measured by a Friday paycheck, or an annual paycheck. I mean, your bottom line for your yearly salary. It is something that you can only measure in terms of generations, because their jobs as mothers is to care, nurture, and in that nurturing, lay the foundation for an entire life, not just a childhood, but entire life.
Yeah, and the other aspect I wanted to bring out was this concept of fear-based love. Whether you want to talk about how so many religions are based on fear, so many relationships in European history is based on fear. Okay, you take a look at the politics of today, and they're based on fear.
Well, and let's talk about that, because there's fear of violence,
yes,
which is clearly one of the issues, but there's also fear of survivability, because at the same time that we talk about this male dominant society and this idea that men can essentially treat women as property, because we don't respect motherhood in the way that we should societally, and I'm sorry, this goes right back to our territories as well. This isn't just an American thing. This is something that we've all moved to a place where, because we don't value motherhood in the way that we should, and make child rearing and child development a community issue, oftentimes a woman feels threatened financially. They feel a threat. That fear is based on their own personal security and the security of their children, based solely on the relationship with the man. And it's like they have no alternative, and that's why you find women oftentimes feeling stuck. When we talked last week about women feeling this sense of dread and not wanting to be alone, and so they compromise. That is not something. Again, that is that fear. That's exactly that fear-based relationship thing that you're talking about.
And then you find people reaching, and they function on what's called at least. Okay, where at least he's got a job,
or at least he doesn't beat me every day.
At least he's leaving the children alone. You take a look at some of the thinking that's going on, and it doesn't help community-wise. And we're not talking just Native American. We're talking across the whole world, okay? And it's very important to understand that. You take a look at what women's needs are, and they're talking health care. And yet all these men in Congress are taking away that health care from the women because they will not give money toward that.
Well, and especially as it relates specifically to reproductive health. And the irony of having, again, this is a men's issue, the fact that male dominance will allow men to legislate over reproductive health. And again, when I talk about reproductive health, I'm not just talking about abortions here. And I'm not even just talking about birth control. I'm talking about what we do to make sure that a woman who is with child and will deliver a child, that her health is taken care of properly. Reproductive health isn't just about stopping the process of reproduction. It's about protecting women who are in the process of reproducing and who not just are going to deliver a child, but who have to care for that child. I mean, when I hear men suggesting that that, and they're always talking really about women who are receiving food stamps, that they need to be drug tested first. I mean, that's another form of male abuse. It's really another form of violence against women, because I mean that is almost. I mean, it's not just an invasion of privacy, but it is such a male domination and physical control mechanism. And again, that fear-based relationship thing that you're talking about. No, and so, and I think it's important that this gets talked about in a way that for one thing, that we men own this problem and prepare ourselves to confront it. Because here's the biggest problem with everything from, I just posted a video about this white man just raging, this racist white man in Ontario raging on a family that appears to be Muslim or Arab of Arab descent. And the problem isn't just that this guy is behaving badly. Not a single white person steps up. Nobody. I mean, here this family and this the gentleman who was being attacked here in this video is really showing incredible restraint. Restraint that most of us only hope that we could demonstrate. Although, when you watch the video, there's many of us also, again, male macho thing, just lay them out. But when that happens, it's that same feeling that Terry Crews felt. If I do this thing, am I going to be? Is there really going to be equity and justice in this conflict? So, and my point is that we all become complicit in bad behavior of each other, but specifically men. Again, this idea of male bonding that sounds good when it's time to crack open a six-pack, but does not cross that line in saying, no, I have a responsibility to my friend to call him out on bad behavior, on violence against his, the mother of his children or his partner, or violence against the children, or racism. The problem is, as men, we either become if not complicit, we are certainly complacent. And this is something that as a society, as a people, within our native territories, but certainly across, even beyond our little communities, this is something that we are ill prepared to deal with. And so we institutionalize those constraints. We let the penal code of the state or the federal government be the arbiter of behavior, I guess. Instead of us confiding and using our interpersonal relationships to say, hey, come on, man, that's not all right. That's not all right that you behave this way. And at some point, and this is where we've got into this discussion many times. At some point, we got to say, look, I can't be a part of this. I see what you're doing, and I don't think we can hang out. I don't think this friendship can survive that level of behavior and that type of behavior. And so I've said this about whether it's a church or a civic organization or even like on our territories, a community or a longhouse, we become too tolerant of bad behavior. We adopt this attitude. Well, we can't tell people what to do. And I say no. I'm not saying we get to tell people what they can and can't do, but we certainly should be able to influence and pressure somebody when they're conducting themselves in an unacceptable way for not just their family, because it doesn't limit itself to their family. I go back to the story that Paul always talks about. If you're raising your precious little baby girl, and you see a family that you hear the effects of what's happening in that household, you hear the violence that man in that household is conducting against his partner, even against his children. And then you say, well, it's none of my business. That's his family. I'm not going to interfere. And so you become tolerant because you can justify not having a place in that activity by saying that's his house, that's his family. But then when your little girl grows up and that family's little boy grows up, and all of a sudden your little girl and that little boy are now taking an interest in each other and engage themselves into a relationship. And then that young man starts to demonstrate the same behavior of his father and starts to abuse your little girl, your daughter, who's now a young woman. Can you still say that you've got no place in stepping in and in interfering or weighing in? See, it comes back, and that's the point that Degarundage always makes, is this is the stuff that comes back, and it comes back on all of us by being complacent and then ultimately complicit in bad behavior. We all have to step up. And this isn't about saying, well, I'm gonna call the cops, or I'm gonna call the marshals, or I'm gonna call CPS, or I'm gonna call, family services, or I'm gonna, I'm gonna call my local legislator, or my or one of the guys on council, or whatever. No, at some point, this isn't just. Look, it's fine to make a phone call for backup, but it requires more than that. As I looked at that video of this racist rant that this white man in Ontario was going through, there's a part of me that just says, if somebody who looked like him, who enjoyed white privilege like this guy does, and has taken white privilege to the point of white supremacy, but if somebody who looked like him stepped up and said, no, your behavior is unacceptable. You can't behave this way. And if another white man or even a white woman had stepped in and had intervened, I don't think it would have had to been a violent conflict or a violent intervention. I think another white person could have shamed him, but nobody of color was going to stop this guy. Not without physically stopping him. So this is where I come back to. So when I want to talk about men's issues, I'm saying that we have a responsibility to do better by our sons, and essentially, it still comes back to a bit of a women's issue, because oftentimes I see it's mothers and aunts and grandmothers who are defending the bad behavior of these sons and these brothers and these nephews and these grandsons. So we can't let the male part of our population degenerate because we don't want to hold them accountable. And again, an expression I just heard, and this was I think coming from the black community, that says, well, how do we deal with men who are violent against their partners and their children? And one of the expressions I heard is, well, people of color can't afford to throw away their men. And so that sounded like a justification, almost to like let it go. Look, I don't know what throwing away a human being really means. If it means locking them up for that behavior, that's not even what I'm suggesting. Or worse, I mean, killing somebody because of their behavior. As a father and a grandfather, I can honestly say there are certain things that if somebody did to a family member of mine, I think I could justify for myself, whether it's societally appropriate or judiciously appropriate. I could see myself taking a life in the defense of my family, or a loved one, and not just a family member. I mean, I could see myself doing that under the right circumstances. But that's not really where, if you have gotten to that place, then you've probably let things go too far. Hey, look, we're at the bottom of the hour, so we'll take a break. We'll go out with a little bit more music, and we'll come back. I'll get a chance to catch up on some of your Facebook comments, and we're back in just a bit. This is John Kane with Ed Schindler. This is Let's Talk Native.
to work every day for that minimum wage. There's a guy, blonde hair, blue eyes, just about your age. Hasn't worked and does half as long as you. He makes twice as much money as you do. Red blue, red blue, red blue, baby, red blue. Every kind of people got every kind of blues, but red man's got red blue. After work, I go home, make myself a drink, grab a glass, a few ice cubes, walk on over to the sink. My old lady says that I ought not to. You'll get sick if you drink that water. Red blue, red blue, red blue, baby, red blue. Every kind of people got every kind of blues, but a red man's got red blues. All right. Lost my job, my woman left. She took her out of my stuff. She left town with my best friend. If that wasn't enough, she took my dog and my guitar too. And all she left me was a case of the blues. Red blues, red blues, red blue, baby, red blue. Every kind of people got every kind of blues, but a red man's got red blues, red blue, red blue, baby, red blue, baby, red blue. Well, every kind of people got every kind of blues, but a red man's got red blues. Got those reservation blues, baby.
All right, then coming back. This is John Kane. I've got Ed Schindler in studio. We went through that was a full Res Blues. I had a lot of comments to go through. If you ever watch this this show and you see me bearing my face in my telephone or my computer, it is related, show related. I just want you to know, like I said, I have a difficult time trying to keep up with comments and do the show at the same time. So I use the break. I use a little musical interlude so I can get a chance to at least look at the comments and acknowledge them anyway, if not respond to them. So try to respond to as many of them on air as possible. But during the break, Ed, you talked about this idea of encouraging, and I don't want to paraphrase you wrongly, but it has to do with who has the power to affect change. And there is an assumption that some people are more empowered than others. And that assumption is not completely inaccurate. I mean, like the racist guy in Ontario. When I suggested a white person who should have intervened, I'm not saying because the white person has more power, although that's what racism does, right? It shifts systemic power to a dominant culture in a racism-based environment. But what I was suggesting here is that a white person would have more influence on the behavior of that individual. And so when we think about again, the problems with male dominance and whether that demonstrates itself in racism or whether it demonstrates itself in violence against women or children or whatever, the one thing that we do have to realize is that if you feel like you are powerless, then you are making that prophecy come true.
Yes.
So we have to assume we do have certain powers, and by utilizing the power that creation provided us, that your birthright is to have that power to carry yourself, to defend yourself, and to uphold the responsibilities that not just your culture places on you, but the necessities of your life rest on you. We all have power. The problem is we yield too much of it. We yield, not wield, but yield too much of it to somebody else who we believe has more influence, and in some cases may. But if we do that consistently, if we don't step up and assert the power that we all have to take corrective action, to take a stand against injustice, then we're depending on somebody else to do that. And again, oftentimes that's institutional, right? We depend on the courts, depend on the cops, we depend on government to, in all cases, provide equity. When in reality, that defies nature.
And what it does is it transfers power between the one who you're trying to assist and the ones who are going to do it. In other words, you still don't have power.
Well, it consolidates power in the wrong places.
What's relatively urgent is that people have to understand influence compared to power, so that the influence is part of the community. It's not power that's going to become part of the community. That influence has to be there, and it has to be engulfing everyone else to have that influence. It doesn't leave people out. It includes people.
Well, and the reality is, when a person becomes aware of an injustice that's happening, whether it's within the four walls of somebody else's home or whether it's demonstrated more visibly within a community, when a woman steps up or when somebody who's in somehow it appears to be in a inferior position to stand up against male dominance or violence or whatever that is. I mean, again, whether it's control of the checkbook or whatever you want to call it, this is where the rest of us come in. Because intervention oftentimes isn't just about stepping in to be the hero on some level of injustice, but to step up among others to do that. So when clearly somebody's crying out for help, the question is, do we turn a deaf ear to it or a blind eye? Do we look the other way? Even if it's a child or a woman, too often we do. And again, I'm not saying that I do or Ed does or anyone in particular, but as a people, as a culture, or as neighbors to each other, people who share a planet together, we see too often that people ignore those in need. And it oftentimes isn't even just about ignoring a person in need. It could be, male dominance isn't just about the abuse of women and children. It's about the abuse of the land. It's about the abuse of other creatures. Animal cruelty. Oftentimes, that's more often than not, that's a male doing that. That's where some of that male dominance. So whether it's a boy, or a teenager, a young man, or Michael Vick and the whole dog fighting issue. I mean, this idea of male dominance does not just end with the abuse of women and children. And I'm not suggesting that shouldn't be a higher priority to us. But what you see is a psychotic behavior that sometimes will start. And I know I watch too much Criminal Minds, right? You'll see a child who has been allowed or their cruelty towards animals is ignored, and that oftentimes will manifest itself in that same kind of cruelty that young man and older man, adult male, will conduct against others. So again, when we talk about men's issues, I've got to say that the biggest influence, and I'm not suggesting that men have more power in this debate, because I don't want to reinforce, or go farther in the enforcement of male dominance, but men, simply by virtue of their relationship, male to male, again, buddies, right? If you look the other way when your buddy, or if you partake in the same, if you see, if you start being influenced by your friends because they party all the time and you want to party with them, if you start being influenced by your friends because they're cheating on their wives or their partners, and so you said, yeah, I want that. I want that for me. So now you're not just complacent and complicit. Now you're participating in the whole thing. So this is where I'm saying that male bonding is important to men. And if somebody feels like their friendships, and their close male friendships are jeopardized by the behavior, then you are in a position of influence, not power, but you are in a position of influence to have an effect on what your male friends do. And certainly if you're an uncle or a brother, or a father or a grandfather in my case, we do have a responsibility to not just protect women as if they're fragile, but protect women because we all should be interested in the security of each other. But again, from a physical standpoint, we should not be tolerant of physical abuse or sexual abuse in any circumstance, and we certainly shouldn't be tolerant of the kind of abuse that we see men oftentimes perpetrate against other life. Look, I'll be the first one to tell a child, hey, there's no reason to break that branch off that tree. Am I concerned about that tree's feelings? No, but there's a destructive nature, and I'm not just picking on boys, but oftentimes you'll see it. I walk through the city all the time, and I go to New York every week to do my show, and I'm amazed sometimes at how often one of those trees they plant within these spots on the sidewalk gets destroyed simply because kids walking by break the branches off, and not thinking about the destructive nature of that behavior. But again, that's the kind of stuff that continues on. So, and so I think our relationship with each other and the influence that we all can have on each other is the kind of stuff that it makes us all better. It doesn't make us weak or overly controlled by society necessarily. I think it improves us as a people, and because we realize that we do have a relationship with each other, all of us, not just within the walls of your household, but within a community, within a region. These are the kind of things that we have to be. We don't have to show tolerance for bad behavior.
No, and that's one of the things that the quotes that people who've lost their power is usually done because they gave it up.
Right. Exactly.
And it's really important to stop and think about some of these things that we talked about before, listening and understanding. I mean, Albert Einstein literally said, you can't solve your problems by using the same thinking that created them. We have to start thinking differently and start thinking in a manner which is going to be positive and productive. And we also have to start thinking in a manner where we work together.
And another quote that I use all the time, and I don't know if it's my original quote or not. I often say the best way to prevent the abuse of authority is not to give it. And so I would say that take that to a different level. The best way to prevent the abuse of power, even physical power, is to not yield to it. And not yield to it, not just as an individual, but not yield to it as a community. So if you don't want to see the abuse of power, then don't yield to it. And it's not just, I'm not saying that to you as an individual who may be in an uneven conflict with somebody who may have more physical power than you, or weapons or whatever else, whatever the whatever tilts the scales. But we as communities need to step up on this stuff. We should not tolerate the abuse, the physical abuse, the sexual abuse, or the abuse of power that any man or any person wields over another. Look, I think, as parents and grandparents, or as husbands and, as fathers, all this stuff, we know that we have a certain responsibility. But that responsibility is not the same thing as power and authority. And I think this is where sometimes these words all get mashed together like it's the same thing. I mean, we talk about within the Ganyanaragoa, these women who are placed in positions, like clan mother is an example of that. It's an English word, but or chief, and the word that we use is Rurionesu or Rayana, and these don't mean leaders. They don't mean lords, even though somebody translated the Ganyanaragoa a long time ago and used Confederate lords. No, that's not what those words mean. What they mean is, they are a responsibility to the people, not an authority over people. So, but that, that's taking it into the political realm. But this is the same thing that exists in interpersonal relationships, in family relationships. Look, I think empowering children is important. And when I say empowering them, I don't mean giving them power and force, or physical power, but empowering their minds and their creativity and all that stuff. And man, that's the stuff that gets stifled in some of these abusive households and abusive relationships. And of course, there's no more significant a way to crush a child than to physically abuse them and to sexually abuse them. I mean, that is something that that takes a lot to overcome. And so we should be completely intolerant. I mean, that should be the thing that we are the most intolerant of. And these oftentimes, and again, I got to get back to it, are men's issues. Not exclusively, but all too often, this kind of abuse and this kind of abuse of authority and power is born out of that whole male dominance that is backed by religion. It's backed by this notion of hierarchy. It's backed by racism. And it's backed by the idea of wealth and the accumulation of wealth. And again, when to kind of take a step back, because I mentioned I was going to talk a little bit about racism. One of the things I got to say, and I have this debate all the time, not just on this show, but on my show in New York where I take callers in. It's amazing to me how many people still can't grasp or refuse to grasp the concept of racism. Racism is not the same as prejudice or discrimination. It's in a class by itself. Racism is not the same as racial bias. To say somebody is a racist is not to say that that word does not apply to somebody who perhaps doesn't like somebody of a different race. That's not racism. That's racial bias. If a black man hates white people, I'm sorry, that's still not racism. That's racial bias. Is it inappropriate? Absolutely. But understanding that some of that ill will and some of that harboring of ill will is born out of intergenerational trauma. Obviously, slavery is a large contributing factor to that. The whole Jim Crow era, racism in general, that the injustices of racism have created, again, a defense mechanism that often manifests itself in just the hate of people of other color. And so, but that's still, see, the difference between racism and racial bias is racism is about supremacy. It is about believing that because of the race that you are, or your genetic makeup, or just your genetics, or the, you know, that is, I don't mean because you're big, you're genetically large. I'm saying that you're genetically white, that you are superior to anybody else. See, racism is about superiority. It's about power, and then it's about the systemic controls that keep that power within a group. Not because they are physically powerful or more physically powerful, or because they are somehow intellectually more powerful. No, simply because the game has been rigged. So when I explain this to people, that racism is a white thing, a black man can't be a racist. He can show racial bias, and this shouldn't be that difficult to understand. But racism is limited to the classification of the racial classification that has control of wealth, that has control of governance, and is oftentimes has the control of religious backing. Racism is oftentimes driven by church, and in the Christian nations of Europe, that was clearly came out of the Vatican. It came out of even as the church is separated from Catholicism to Protestant churches. It still was based on this idea that the Christian nations of Europe were superior, were racially superior, not just cultural. I mean, what happened is the church backs that superiority notion. So even if a person of color becomes a Christian, they are still racially inferior, and that's what racism is. So look, you may not like somebody because they're different than you. Not liking somebody, or even hating somebody, or even committing acts of violence against people in a different, is still not the same thing as racism. Racism is about the belief that the race that you characterize yourself as is superior to other races. And the reason that it can exist is because it has systemic implications. That's why what was the list? I saw something posted this week that listed how many billionaires there are in the United States, and it was hundreds. But almost all of them were white, and I don't mean the majority of them white. I mean, of the billionaires in the United States, I think you could count the ones who weren't white on one hand. Of the hundreds of billionaires in the United States, you could count the ones of color. Yeah, you can throw Oprah in there, and a few other people of color, and that was it. And that's a systemic control to make sure that wealth stays within the white class.
And you can take that even further. Instead of race, they do class. Okay,
but that's oftentimes, but you're right. I mean, it's oftentimes directly connected. Race and class are directly connected.
And then there's also gender, where they see themselves as superior because, well, they're male and that's a female. She's weaker and etc. That's a kind of thinking that's basically that's taught.
Well, and that's the inequity that is tied not just to race but to male dominance. And yes. I think that's what's and that's what we're talking about here. So when I talk about men's issues, the biggest weakness in society is usually associated with this notion of male dominance that people just can't seem to get away from. Because here's what happens, and I say the same thing about racism. There's a direct connection between white supremacy, white fragility, or white. Let me back it up. White supremacy, white privilege, and white fragility. But it's the same thing that you can associate with gender. This idea of male dominance creates a male privilege, a privilege that can be just a full expectation that because you're a man and it's a man's world, that somehow that you should not, that you should, there's no way that you should feel threatened by gender equality. and at some point, male dominance and male privilege becomes threatened in the form of male fragility. And oftentimes, when you see the violence that comes out of some of these men, it is based more on their own insecurities and their own fragile nature. They feel threatened, and that's how they lash out. They lash out in the last bastion of privilege that they have, which may be a certain amount of physical dominance.
Take a look at the president.
Well, he's a perfect example of all those things. But hey, we're almost out of time, and one of the things I try to do each show is I do try to acknowledge my sponsors. So let me go ahead and give my personal thanks to Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses, Eric White and ERW Enterprises, Legacy 420 and Tandanega, my good friend Mike General with Mikey G's and Mikey's Emporium, and friends who may or not necessarily be involved in business or industry or whatever else, but friends that just help when they can. And that includes my good friend here, Ed Schindler, my friend Cynthia Trice, Roger Jock, Neville Spring. And I also need to acknowledge individuals and other businesses who have supported the show in the past and allow us to do this for so many years. After we've been doing this for over 8 years, and this idea that we are supported by individuals and businesses that allow us to continue to educate, inform, and entertain all these years is something that I'm grateful for, and again, it's why I can do what I do. Look, I also want to thank Unity Stream and Apache Radio Net for providing our streaming. Again, I want to thank CKWE for the simulcast and the rebroadcast of our show, as well as some of our internet partners, Netroots Radio, Real People's Media, Indigenous Resistance Radio. And I also want to thank all of the group pages that allow us to post the video, our Facebook live streams, and some of the other videos and audios that I post up. I want to thank all of you who share it, including I'll give a special thanks to my wife for sharing this program, the Facebook live stream in particular, to so many of those group pages. But all of you who share our SoundCloud audios, who share our YouTube videos, and share the Facebook live streams, I thank you all for helping us get the word out and for furthering the conversation. That's
Yes.
that's what the program is about, and it is with your help that I can do that. So I want to thank you all. Look, I want to give a shout out again to remind people that we have a new website, which is www.letstalknative.com. No apostrophe before the S and no separation of the words. One word. letstalknative.com. That's where you can go. And from that website, you can find the links to our podcast, to our videos, to our Facebook live stream, all of that stuff. And again, a simple search of Let's Talk Native with John Kane podcast will provide you a whole list of platforms for subscribing to podcasts. I encourage you to do that, and of course, subscribe to our Let's Talk Native TV YouTube channel. This is John Kane with Ed Schindler. I want to thank you for listening. Yahweh.
Yahweh.